co-host Christian Dominique will be joining shortly. But this week we have a really special guest with us. Katherine Martinko is on the pod. Katherine is a Canadian writer, journalist, and author based out of Ontario. She's the author of Childhood Unplugged, Practical Advice to Get Kids Off Screens and Find Balanced, which was published originally in 2023, and it was also shortlisted for the Forward Indies Awards. She writes The Analog Family, a newsletter which has nearly 10,000 subscribers and a weekly column in the Globe and Mail. She's a formal speaker on behalf of the Anxious Generation campaign founded by Jonathan Haidt, and she has a second book coming this November. Katherine, it's a real pleasure and honor to have you on the podcast.
Thank you for the great introduction, Mark. It's a pleasure to be here with you today.
Absolutely. So one of the first questions I always like to ask our guests is more the origin story of how people got to do, what they're doing. You worked extensively. You had a career in digital publishing before this, so you're quite familiar with the internet. When did you start looking at what screens were doing to children specifically, and how it's affecting their thinking, and what really got you started down this road?
Yeah, well, I would say that there was a few different events that occurred in my life that sort of led me to this point of writing and exploring this topic in great detail. The first is actually a short anecdote I'll share with you. It was something that happened about 10 years ago when I had a little baby. My youngest son was a few months old, and I had met a woman who had recently immigrated to Canada. And she and I were sitting in a doctor's waiting room together. We both had babies around the same age. And I commented on how quiet and calm her baby was, how, passive, placid, never cried, never really moved. Whereas my child was the complete opposite. He was a little lunatic who made it his life's mission to evade sleep at every single opportunity. And I asked her about this, and she said, "Oh, well, it's easy. I just drug her to keep her calm." And I said, "What are you talking about?" And she said that she had this special syrup she'd brought from the motherland that she would just shake into the baby's milk bottle and administer to the child. And she said to me, "It makes her so easy to manage. You might want to try it with your own kid." And I said, "No, I will not be doing that." She then said she was hoping to ask the doctor for a refill that day. And I said, "The doctor won't give you that because we don't do that here in Canada. That's just not part of our parenting culture. We do not sedate perfectly healthy children to make them easier to manage." And then she said something I will never forget. She paused for a moment and looked around the waiting room, and she pointed out that every single child in the waiting room was sitting completely quiet, completely calm, completely still, with their eyeballs glued to an iPhone or to a tablet. And she turned to me and she said, "Are you so sure about that?" And I realized in that moment that she made this really powerful point that the Canadian kids were being sedated too, just in a very different sort of way. And I like to tell that story because I feel like it just shines a light on a social experiment that's gone terribly wrong. I'm not trying to blame those parents for struggling to deal with sick children in a doctor's waiting room. I know how hard that can be. I've been there before. But I do think that we've all seen too many scenes like that doctor's waiting room where we are just, there's children who are so engrossed in their devices that they are completely checked out from the world around them. And it's not surprising. I mean, these things landed in parents' laps like some kind of miraculous invention that really seemed like something that could be too good to be true. And in fact, it was. And so now many people are starting to question that and wonder what it is that we can do to reclaim whatever it is that we've lost. So that was sort of a pivotal moment in my personal life. And then I would say too, I was writing a lot about the power of outdoor play, the power of nature in children's lives, how important that is. And I kind of realized it was tied to these devices because the devices were actually becoming an impediment to many children going outside and playing the way that they are supposed to, emotionally, socially, physically. There's just so many benefits to that. So that's partly how I started writing about it. And then as time progressed, more and more people started asking me about my own parenting philosophy because I was raising my kids with minimal screens at home, no TV, no iPads. It was pretty reduced compared to a lot of other households. And it wasn't anything I'd ever really thought about consciously. It was just organic. It's just how I did things. And the more people started asking for advice and the more I thought about that scene with the doctor's waiting room and all those kids on their devices, I started to think that maybe I've really got something here to talk about that I'm doing differently, that others might be able to learn from based on my personal experience. And that's when I really started to delve into the research.
Yeah, I love that story because a lot of people think that, the devices the kids are mostly culpable, right? Because they are addicted to the devices. But actually, the parents do play a really important role in this because they're oftentimes exasperated. They're really tired and they're looking for some sort of digital pacifier that's just going to basically sedate the kids, essentially. Like the woman said in your example, we're perhaps more okay with the devices than actually giving them drugs to sedate them, right? Because that image conjures a really, a lot of problematic ideas
Mhm.
about, giving kids medications. Um, I actually have a similar story. I went on vacation and there was a kid crying at the table next to me, and I've told this story before on the podcast. The kid was crying, and the mom was pregnant. She was looking at her phone, and the kid kept crying, usually asking for attention, trying to get some needs met. And the mom just gave the kid a phone, and he was like 5 or 6 years old, and I saw him just scrolling TikTok and the crying stopped. So it does offer immediate short-term relief to the parents, essentially. And it's easy to understand why this would be a very accessible strategy, or just an easy strategy for a lot of parents to revert to, especially with the omnipresence of devices. So I really appreciate you sharing that story. And hello, Christian. How are you doing? Christian just joined us.
Hi, Mark, and hi, Katherine again. Sorry I
Hello.
was late. There was actually a reason related to what we talked about, unsupervised play. So I had, when I was 8 or 9 years old, had to ride a bike, a BMX, and broke my tooth. And then yesterday evening, it broke again, so I had to go to
Oof.
emergency dentist to get it fixed. So
Oh
that's
no.
But those are the stories that you remember, right? So you went out on your own. Your parents weren't there. You broke your tooth, and you learned valuable life lessons, and you felt capable.
So Catherine just shared a story of how she got started with this whole journey of, 10 years ago, sitting in the waiting room doctor's office with her kid and speaking to another woman who was talking about giving her child, who was unusually quiet, some sort of syrup or medication that sedated the child. And Catherine's reaction was, no, how could that be done? And then essentially, the woman pointed to the fact that a lot of the other kids were already using their phones, and it's a different type of sedation. And that's really, what got her started. Um, you often use the term digital minimalist, and I want to make sure that our listeners really understand from the start what that term means, because a lot of parents will think a clean cut, getting kids completely off the screen, and imagine something that's unrealistic, especially for a kid who's already had their phone. What does digital minimalism actually mean in practice? And like, what are you not advocating here?
Yeah, well, I really love this term, digital minimalism. I can't take credit for it. Unfortunately, it was coined by author Cal Newport. He's a computer science professor at Georgetown University and an author of many books, one of which is titled Digital Minimalism. And it was hugely influential in my work, and I often reference it. I just think he's an amazing thinker on this topic, very insightful. Anyways, he came up with this term, digital minimalism, and he defines it as a philosophy of technology use in which you focus your online time on a small number of carefully selected and optimized activities that strongly support your values, and then you happily miss out on everything else. And so I love that framing of it, that it's there, it is a tool, it is accessible to you. We're not saying do away with it completely. We're just, you need to use it in a way that improves your experience of work or research or communication, and not just fritter away your life on this device. And so, in terms of practical applications for my own life, when I think about this digital minimalism philosophy, I think of it as, first of all, not being anti-tech. I very much love modern technology. I think it's enabled my entire career. I mean, look what we're doing right now. I'm sitting in my home having this call with you, and you're in your various offices, and it's just quite amazing what has been made possible by this technology. So I'm not anti-tech. I think that we need to learn to treat it as a tool, not as a toy. I think that when you are a digital minimalist, you also are employing delay tactics as a parent and implementing strict rules and limits surrounding its use. So you do not just let it flood into your life and infiltrate every single corner of your life. You are very selective. That leads to another part of the definition or application, which I would say is to try to be very choosy about the technologies that you're using. So to think critically, to think long and hard about whether or not you really want to introduce a particular technology, a platform or a device, an app into your life. And if it does not support your values, if it is not serving you, you reject it, you remove it from your life, you walk things back if they're not working for you or for your family. I think a digital minimalist also strives to preserve childhood and recognizes it as a sacred time in life, a fleeting period of time that's never coming back, and it must be fiercely defended. I think that technology is inevitable at a certain point in a young adult's life as they get older, but I do think that we should become a lot more defensive and protective about keeping it out of our youngest members of society's lives. I think that's very important. And finally, I would say that a digital minimalist always prioritizes in-person interactions. So the technology might be wonderful and amazing and seductive and do incredible things, but if there is a real live human being sitting right in front of you, that person needs your attention more than anyone else. And I think that that's important, not only in the parent-child relationship, but even just out in the world as members of a society where we interact with people on a daily basis. So that's sort of how I would summarize it. I think that it's an approach that is more manageable. It's doable. It's not doing away with tech completely or vilifying it. It's recognizing what it can do, but also trying to take back control of the technology. I do believe that we can coexist, but we have to be the ones who are the boss of it. We have to be the ones who retain the control of our time and our attention.
When you say we, you're referring to adults enforcing, because the onus does fall on the parents to enforce this with their kids, right?
Yes, and you did mention that earlier on when you were responding to my story. So that is a big theme that I talk about here, which is reclaiming parental authority. This
Mhm.
is tricky territory. I will admit that. I know that some people don't want to even touch it. It can be misconstrued as parent blaming, parent shaming, and that is not at all what I want to do here. My goal is very much to empower parents and to make them feel like they have a sense of agency, because right now, so many parents are feeling helpless. They're feeling
Mhm.
hopeless. They're feeling like it's too late. The number of parents who've come up to me after talks that I give and, broken down in tears and said, I regret so much giving my kid a smartphone when I did, or letting my kid sign up for social media, all of these things. And I just think that that is heartbreaking. And those parents need to know and be reminded of the fact that they can make change. They can make a difference in
Mm.
their child's life right now, no matter how far gone it might be. So, yes, I do think that parents are an incredibly important part of this very complex problem. This is a multi-layered problem. Of course, we need the high-level legislative changes. We need the tech companies held accountable. We need our school boards to tighten up screen rules, all of that. I'm sure we'll get into some of that too, but I see
Oh yeah.
parents as just a really important foundational component of the solution that is desperately needed here.
Hmm.
Well, we definitely agree at all. We are not against tech. We're not against parents. We're not trying to blame or shame things people are doing now or they have done in the past. It's more of giving the tools and awareness
Mhm.
that there's other ways to see the world. And I had the pleasure to read your book. We talked about this earlier this week. And I really like the concept of NOMO instead of FOMO, right? So fear of missing out, or necessity of missing out, or necessity of sometimes missing out, as you reference. And it's kind of choosing with intention, and always choosing, real life interaction if you can. We believe definitely in real connection. That's one of the pillars that was created to bring back belonging. And I think there's a lot of similarities in how we also see parents telling us that they don't feel that they belong necessarily to a community. The online communities cannot really replace the real world communities. What have you seen and heard, Catherine, on those subjects?
Oh, well, I think that there's sort of this false narrative that you have to be online in order to be included and to know everything that's going on, that fear of missing out, that FOMO that you mentioned. And yet, and I hear that a lot from parents, particularly in discussions with their teenagers who want to be on social media because they think that that's where everything's going on and they fear missing out on things if they're not part of those networks. And it's true that your kid will miss out on a lot of things if they're not using social media. But what I like to counter with is just think of everything that they're missing out on if they are on social media. The average teen spends about 5 hours a day on social media right now in North America. And that's just astonishing. That's 5 hours worth of real life that is passing them by. And so there's this enormous opportunity cost that I'm seeing. And I think that that almost doesn't get enough attention in this debate. Like, we talk about the primary harms, the direct harms that are caused by excessive screen time. There's so many, things there that we've got, like physical implications, emotional implications, social implications, neurological, emotional, all of that, as I'm sure you're well familiar with. But then there's just is this opportunity cost, all the things that the kids are missing out on and aren't doing because they're on their devices. That sense of time passing them by, that sort of uneasy feeling you get when you look up in the online worlds and remind ourselves that what matters the most is what's happening in reality around us at any given moment.
Yeah, you
You
just
talked
mentioned children, and absolutely an opportunity cost. What does that actually mean, for a child's development, though? Like, what you mentioned a little bit, socialization. I mean, boredom used to be the impetus for exploration, right? When you didn't have anything to do, you'd go out, you'd play, you would just explore the world. But now those hours, 5 hours per day, are being consumed by, an ungodly amount of information, that online, unlimited amounts of distractions. What is being displaced in those hours?
Yeah, actually, the numbers are even worse than that. The 5 hours only refers to social media exclusively. So
Right,
it's
7.5
five,
for
it's five
yeah.
and a half hours on average for young kids, ages 8 to 12, on average of
Mhm.
screen time in total. And it's 8 hours and 40 minutes on average for teenagers.
Mm,
So that's just like age 13 to 18, which is
average.
astonishing when
Wow.
you think about it. Close to 9 hours a day. And that's entertainment based screen time only. So that's not screen time that's being used for schoolwork, in class work, or any sort of necessary communications, which means that scrolling for fun is the only thing. It's the biggest thing that kids are doing with their lives. It's arguably more time than they're in school. It could be more time than they're sleeping. It's definitely more time than they're spending hanging out with friends or with their family, reading books, exercising, all of those things. So some of those things are exactly what's being displaced by this. So they are failing to move their bodies. We're seeing huge implications physically, increased rates of sedentariness, obesity, weight gain tied to binge eating because it's difficult for kids to regulate their appetites when they're looking at a screen. We're seeing impacts on sleep quality and quantity as well, because why would you go to sleep if you have TikTok reels to be scrolling through? They're hard to put down. They're designed to be they're designed for compulsive use. And then, of course, sleep quality is impaired because kids are checking their phones throughout the middle of the night. Often they're going to bed feeling very heightened or emotional because of what they've been looking at in the time leading up to bed. We're seeing increases in myopia, epidemics of nearsightedness. That's been really interesting reading about that. Some reports from ophthalmologists saying eyeballs are very dried out because kids aren't blinking as much because they're looking at screens so much. We are seeing emotional repercussions, of course. Kids are being
Mm.
exposed to content that's far too mature for them. So there's this normalization of hypersexualized, gory, violent content that would never fly in the real world for kids to be seeing that kind of stuff. But it gets a pass because it's happening online. We're seeing neurological changes. The brain is rewiring due to exposure to excessive screen time. There's that conditioning to hyperstimulating formats, gamification. It's harder for kids to sit with larger, more complex, bigger chunks of information now compared to what they used to do. They're not going outside. They're not playing. Fine and gross motor skills are failing to develop as a result of not spending enough time just out in the real world, playing in creative ways with other kids of mixed ages. And socially, I think too, it's sort of ironic that often these devices and platforms are touted as social connectors, but they end up undermining the very kinds of social connections that kids truly need. And kids spend a lot less time interacting with the people around them. Also, their immediate family. A kid who's in their room texting their friends is missing out on hours talking to their parents and talking to their siblings and forging the relationships that really are the ones that will last. Those are the ones that are going to stick around long after those online friends have ghosted them or deleted their profiles or just disappeared. So yeah, I think that we are exchanging a whole lot of real life in favor of these devices that might seem really fun and enthralling right now, but ultimately are not adding the kind of value that kids deserve at this stage in their lives.
So
Yeah.
thanks for that insight. I would add that in growing up, you're easily finding, role models around you, right? So if you're missing out in the family dynamics, and we know that those devices are, potentially addictive or definitely addictive, um, how would you as a family model that kind of human interaction in the family? Can you give some concrete example to make sure that you're not all in the room and all on your own device or computer?
Yeah, well, one rule that I really like, it's known as the 4T rule. So no talking, texting, tapping on a phone, or TV when another person is present. And this rule, I can't remember where it came from. I know I came across it a few years ago, but I often reference it in my talks now. But basically, it's not saying don't do those things. Like, by all means, you can text and talk and tap and watch TV whenever you want, but save it for when you're alone. Again, prioritizing that sense of being present for the people that you're around. So in our home, that means, there's no phones at the dinner table ever. We try to keep the car as a time for conversation, not be on our phones ever in the car, even on long trips, phones or tablets for that matter. Again, there's a wonderful, actually, stat that I often quote from Sherry Turkle, who's a researcher at MIT. And she wrote in one of her books that it takes 7 minutes for a conversation to go deep. So in the first 7 minutes of speaking to someone, you sort of cover the superficialities of your day, what's for dinner, how was school, how was work. And then at that 7-minute mark, that's when someone has to take a risk. Someone has to offer up a vulnerability or make a provocative observation or ask a difficult question. And then you give the conversation a chance to deepen, to go into those, explore the tougher topics that many teens in particular, but even younger kids need to discuss. And the great tragedy of our times is that fewer and fewer conversations are going deep because everyone has this escape hatch in their hands. So I think that it's important to carve out phone-free spaces in the home and normalize times and places where people are not on their devices. So parental modeling is, of course, a huge part of that. I go for walks with my kids and I don't take my phone along. I think that that's really important. We do not take our phones into our bedrooms, so the phones stay down in the kitchen at night. I expect that of my child. I strive to do the same with my own device. So there's these sorts of things, and also filling the home, of course, with interesting, stimulating things for the kids to do so that being on one's phone is not just sort of the default activity when we are together. There's other stuff to do. There's books to read and games to play and jigsaw puzzles on the go and musical instruments and, baking ingredients, just all kinds of things that can potentially absorb their attention and their time.
I know
So
that
we
we're talking a lot about kids here, but I'm curious how you would approach a conversation, perhaps with an adult loved one that is spending too much time on their phone in your presence. It's something that I've dealt with, bringing it up, and then the person just keeps using their phone and they justify, it's an important email, it's like, how would you approach that conversation with somebody?
I think it depends on what your relationship is with that person. If
Mm.
it's a partner, someone that you can have a very close, frank conversation with, I would maybe focus more on how it's making you feel and explain how it pushes you out. You are made to
Mm.
feel like you matter less than the person or the thing that's on the device, and how that can feel very hurtful. It is a sort of form of rejection. I think we downplay it in our society, and I do think that the time for a degree of greater outrage really is required. I've been writing lately about needing a new civil etiquette for, you know, basically starting to stigmatize is like whipping out a phone in the presence of another person. It should not be okay to do that. So I think it's all right to talk about that. If a person is like adults have different relationships with their phones than kids. I do recognize that. We have
Right.
work to do. We have to sometimes be online. I would say in those cases, try to batch your tasks as much as you can and try to encourage this other person to combine their tasks into a certain time of day if they can, and just try to be present, of course, when they are with you and not be multitasking. I think that multitasking is, well, we know it to be quite inefficient. It's sort of an impossibility with the human brain, but we still try. It's hard though. I think that you can't really control how other people behave. I know I tell that to parents too. You can't control how other parents are handling their kids' screen time habits. All you can do is control your own household as best you can, if we even really do control it. But we can establish norms and expectations for behaviors in our own homes. And you never know what kind of ripple effect your behaviors are having on other people too, what they're noticing about you. And maybe that person will start to feel seen and start to feel that warmth of generosity of the attention that you're pouring onto them, and they might want to start reciprocating that in turn. But it is a hard conversation to have with another adult, for sure.
Makes a lot of sense. Thank you.
And as for children, you're talking about reclaiming parental authority, and I agree that that has been perhaps missed, but it's always a balance. There's also this self-determination theory by Dicey and Ryan that talks about autonomy, competence, and relatedness that drives intrinsic motivation, right? So if we're the parent with authority, that might be seen as a reason to rebel, right? So how can we exert our authority and still give, you know, kids self-determination to some degree?
Well, there is a difference between being authoritative and being authoritarian. I'm sure you're familiar with the four different kinds of parenting. There's also permissive and neglectful, neither of which is ideal. So the goal is really to be authoritative, which is setting clear limits and expectations for a child with clear consequences, which do get implemented when it's necessary. But also, the child feels heard. The child's opinion is considered, even if it is not necessarily applied. Sometimes it might be if it's a really good suggestion, but other times it isn't if it really doesn't make sense or the parent knows better. So I think that it's part of a broader, healthier relationship with the child where the child still feels like they are a respected member of the household. But they do understand that their parent does know more about the world than they do and retains the right to be able to make these calls, especially when it comes to issues of safety. So I think that when you consider child development, it is a child's job to grow and to learn and to push up against limits and to challenge and ultimately to rebel to a certain extent, depending on your child's personality. And it is the parent's job to push back and to hold that line within reason, of course. Again, not trying to be authoritarian by any means, but to push back. And I think that the child, even though they might act like they hate it or tell you that they hate it, they ultimately deep down want to know that someone else is looking out for them, that a parent who is older and wiser and just has more knowledge about the world and more experience is keeping them safe and, holding that line. I use that phrase a lot in my writing recently. And so this is hard though, because it goes against a societal norm that's obviously developed over the last couple generations where parents very much want to be their child's best friend. And that is well intentioned. I mean, I want to be my kid's best friend too. I want them to think I'm the coolest person on earth, but that is not my job. My job is to be their mother, and I'm the only one who can be their mother. There are many other people out there who can be their friends. So for now, that will mean that sometimes I have to fight with my kids. And I can do that in a really respectful, caring, loving way. I can explain it. I can try to justify it. They won't necessarily agree with everything I say, but I don't have to convince them. I can lay out my case and then, set that rule. So this is a little bit more of a tough love approach, I think, that than many parents are comfortable with. But I am hearing more experts speaking in favor of this. I know I've had conversations extensively with Dr. Jean Twenge about this, and she does say that parents need to start reclaiming that authority and being comfortable having those tough conversations with their kids, even if they're not getting their kids on board and convincing them of this. What's interesting too is the number of young adults and kids now in their 20s who are looking back and expressing resentment and anger that their parents didn't protect them sufficiently from social media when they were younger. So I think that in itself is very powerful evidence that we must do this for our children, and we need to shift the cultural norm and make it a little bit more accessible, or a little more normal, I guess I would say, for parents to take a stand against it instead of being the odd ones out right now that are taking a stand. So it's not easy though.
I love that approach, and I had a tough conversation with my son, who's 16, last month, and it was a bit, as you mentioned, right? So I actually explained to him that it was my job to give some boundaries, and that I would still listen to his opinion, but that in some cases my opinion has to be the one that wins, right? So, and it's not a war. It's just, as you mentioned, they know, and you can even remind them, dad doesn't know everything, mom doesn't know everything, but perhaps they have a little bit more experience, a little bit more wisdom, and they're also open to your opinion, right? So I think that approach is actually including them, but just to think that a child or even a teenager can know everything about anything, and also the fact that they have, peer pressure, their societal norm, and they're trying to conform because that's the age where they want to be, looked at as the cool kid or in the gang, right? So we can be aware of that. They can even be aware of that, but it's sometimes difficult for them to make those decisions that we can make for them, right?
Yeah, no, I agree. And I think it's very much about hearing your child and understanding what is the core issue here. What are they struggling with and feeling that they need in their life that's causing them to act out in this way? And if that can be addressed in a way that satisfies your rules and boundaries as a parent, while also giving them what they need, that can work out well. So I'll give you one little example. Last year, I actually found out that my son, he's 16 now, so he was 15 then, almost 16, had secretly opened a Snapchat profile on his desktop computer. He didn't have a phone at the time, and of course, I got quite upset because my kids are not allowed to have social media until at least the age of 16. And here I am talking about this subject, and then I found out that he had just done this, so he'd only had it for a week or two, and he got very emotional when I confronted him, and we had this conversation about him doing this, going against my will. And when we actually got down to the core issue, it was that his best friend had an Android phone, and he was not able to text his friend from the computer, because normally he was able to text using iMessage from the computer using an Apple ID, which is kind of that's our workaround until the kids get a smartphone. And he wasn't able to text his friend. And so he said he was always borrowing my phone to text his friend. He was calling from the landline. And these workarounds just were so onerous and so inconvenient that he finally figured he would just get Snapchat, and then he'd be able to directly message his best friend. And so at that point, I realized, well, maybe, after his 16th birthday, we could then visit the possibility of getting him his first smartphone with lots of safeguards and rules surrounding how it would be used. And so I suggested that, and he agreed to it, and he deleted that profile. I was there when he did it. We deactivated the whole thing, got rid of it. He does not have Snapchat anymore. And he does have a phone now that he's 16, and we have some very clear rules surrounding its use. And he's able to text his best friend. And I feel like that was a way of just hearing him and sort of being willing to compromise as well. But he also had to wait several months before he turned 16. So there was that period of time from deleting the Snapchat account to actually getting the phone. But he knew we were moving in that direction. So yeah, I think as parents, we do need to hear our kids and make sure that we're not expecting impossible, unrealistic things of them, but also holding them to a certain standard that makes us feel like we are doing our job.
Thanks for that story, because yes, we have talked to a lot of parents and kids who have, two Instagram profiles. They have a secret Snapchat. They figured out the Wi-Fi code, even though you think that they didn't. So we have to also not put blinders on and saying it's better to communicate and to listen to them as well. Actually, that's one of the thing I did in a workshop with teenagers. I got them to take the role of a parent and then switch and have a conversation with their parents about why they want to have phone use and understand the parent's point of view as well, right?
Mm-hmm.
So I'm curious, because you mentioned like getting to the core issue. What do you think? And oftentimes we talk about social media being a symptom of the underlying core problem, right? Um, what do you think the core issue amongst most kids is? Just an inability to tolerate boredom? Like, why do they revert to social media? Why do they watch these videos for almost 9 hours a day?
Oh, that's a good question. I think that when we give a child a device that is as seductive as a phone or a tablet, they can't not use it. The
Mm.
device itself is just designed for compulsive use. I mean, we know this even as adults. If we have smartphones, we really struggle not to check them, many, many, many times a day. So I think that we are just asking kids to do the impossible. I think that kids are naturally wired to entertain themselves, to thrive in opportunities with boredom. So I think boredom is a richly creative state. I think that it is deeply uncomfortable for kids. No one likes to be bored, and kids will always move through boredom and get to the other side, which is where they discover all kinds of wonderful new interests and hobbies and skills, and they can develop new abilities. But if we give them devices that immediately can distract them and entertain them, they will never become bored. So we've essentially eliminated boredom by developing watching tablets
Yep.
and smartphones for their entertainment purposes. And I think that that's a tremendous loss. Boredom is something that kids need. It leads to that play. And we know that childhood play is rehearsal for adulthood. It is where kids practice and engage with each other. They learn communication skills, negotiation skills. They learn how to lose with grace and not, throw little tantrums. They learn how to play fair and not cheat, because then they'll get kicked out of the game. So all of that is really important for kids. But these devices I think that they just make the rest of life impossible. You cannot give a kid one of these things and expect them to be able to manage it. It should not be on them. And then we should not be upset when they're incapable of putting it down and going outside to play, because we've given them this thing that's just, flashy and captivating. So really, I think that in order to promote that sort of play and create opportunities for boredom, the devices have to go. They have to be removed from the equation completely. And parents need to be a lot stricter about creating those opportunities for kids to just welcome boredom. Parents should not be afraid of boredom. They should also not view it as their own job to have to entertain a child. Again, that's kind of part of this societal shift in parenting, where we think that a bored child is a sign of parental failure, inadequate stimulation. And I think that that's an unfortunate additional burden that we're putting on a lot of parents, because our jobs really should be made easier, not harder, when we get the kids off of the devices. So yeah, it does require a bit of a shift to promote that. But as long as you can just subtract yourself from the equation and let the kids be, kids will do an amazing job at getting themselves out of a bored state and into a creative play state, given the opportunity. But with the presence of those devices, I think that it's almost an impossibility.
So that brings us actually, earlier today, I got a message, someone specifically referencing that he was a new parent, and was happy that we created the smarter phone. So the smarter phone is made to be the first phone. So you mentioned that your child has just had his first cell phone, and we have in the phone some caveats where it's actually a smartphone, but it's smarter because it knows that it's normally addictive, and it tells you to go for a swim, go to a library, go cook for your parents, go do some outdoor play, put your phone down and read. And it checks that it's an OS, so it has the whole information. You cannot hack it, and you can have some parental guidance, but actually it's helping the child or the teen to have those behaviors that is difficult with a normal phone, right? Or some parents use a dumb phone, but they don't have the whole information that they might need. How did you envision and apply kind of similar or different concepts? I think you've mentioned some type of contract, and how is that working with the introduction of the first phone, let's say?
Yeah, well, speaking very generally, I do encourage parents to wait until at least the age of 16 to give a kid a smartphone. There's abundant evidence to show that the longer you wait to give a child a smartphone, the better the longer term mental health outcomes are, especially for girls. It's most pronounced. And Dr. Jean Twenge has said that 16 should be the age at which you give a kid their first smartphone, not before, because giving a smartphone should be on par with getting a driver's license in terms of the level of maturity that's required to handle one. And that really resonated with me. I had, for years, my oldest son had been asking, when can I get my first phone? And I kept saying, I don't know. I just don't have an answer for you, because I don't know. And I don't want to make a promise that I can't keep or lead you to think it's coming sooner than it is. But I also needed to be realistic. So I heard her say that, and it made sense. And then obviously we had this incident with the Snapchat account last summer. And then he was accepted into an exchange program abroad. So he'll be leaving this summer for a full year of study in Japan, actually. So it just felt like the time had come to give him a phone, kind of get him acclimatized to using it in a responsible way, with lots of limits. So his father and I sat down and wrote up a phone contract, which outlines clear expectations for use as well as consequences for misuse, and a few key points in that contract are that his father and I own his phone. So we pay for it, we pay for the plan, and we also have the passcode. And so it is ours. It is a privilege that he has it. It is not, it's not a right. It can be taken away at any point. I've made it very clear that I do periodic spot checks without forewarning. And that is uncomfortable for a parent. As we know, it can feel like you're sort of invading privacy. And, every time I look at his phone, it's kind of like, ugh, it feels a little odd, but I've also made it very clear. I always tell him, I said, I do have to check it. I actually have to do this. And I think that privacy matters less than parenting. I think as parents, we have to make sure that the things that our kids are engaging with online are safe, and also they're not private if they're happening on someone's phone anyways. So we have to kind of get over that idea that we're somehow somewhere where no one is existing or no one is seeing. So that's been, I try to do that when I remember. He cannot take it in his bedroom ever at night. It has to stay down in the kitchen, as I mentioned before. That's a big rule. Again, Dr. Jean Twenge says if there's one change you make in your teen's life, it should be that. Keep the phone out of their bedroom. He also cannot take it to school. So that's one that surprises parents a lot, because often they give the first phone and they say it's to enable communication in between home and school during that commute time. And I say no. I mean, that's an opportunity for him to be unreachable, for him to just be out on his own in the world, just like we all were growing up as kids. This really is not that foreign a concept. We just need to normalize it again in our society. And then, of course, when he's at school, I don't want to be able to text him because that's very tempting. He needs to focus on school, and I need to rely on the school protocols to communicate with him if something comes up. And that acts as friction, that acts as a barrier, because I would text him about random things if he had his phone, whereas I'm not going to call the school about something minor and ridiculous. So I do think as parents, we owe it to our kids to stop communicating with our kids during the school day. Even if they have a phone at school, which they should not, in my opinion, we should make a point of not ever perpetuating that issue at all. So the phone came at 16. He has two younger brothers now who are eagerly awaiting their 16th birthdays so that they can get phones. But I feel like the questions have subsided because they now know that precedent has been set. They know when they're going to get it. And I offer workarounds. So we have a landline. I would say my youngest son, who just turned 11, is the one who uses the landline the most. And he calls everyone. He calls his best friend. He calls his grandparents. He calls me. It's really easy. If I'm out of the house, he can reach me. I can call the house and just reach whoever's there. So that's been a really great addition to our home. And then I would say my middle son, who's 14, he's in grade 9. He's the one who uses the computer the most to text his friends. So he uses my Apple ID, my iMessage on the computer, which is separate from my phone. So I don't get all of his texts on my phone. He keeps it all on that computer, but it lives in a common area of the home in this permanent location. So he logs on, has to make a conscious choice to log on, send these messages, make plans with his friends, and then he goes out and hangs out with them. And it's, nothing inappropriate is happening because it's public. I mean, his brothers are also on that computer. They're reading all those texts too. So, it's very much there for everyone to see. And it's not living in his pocket every single, accessible every minute of the day. So it doesn't usurp as much of his time and attention as it would if it were on a device. So that's been valuable. I mean, I think that I'm meeting him where, partway, where he's able to still have these conversations with his friends and participate in the group chats and get his fair share of ridiculous memes and videos and things like that. But when he gets up from that computer and goes outside, it's not with him anymore. And he's not going to be distracted. So those are some of our workarounds. I know some families will opt for basic phones, flip phones, smartwatches, different things like that. Based on where we live, just a few blocks away from their school, in a central location in our town, close to most of their friends, that never seemed necessary. Maybe I would have sought out a basic phone if they were taking long bus rides every single day or staying late after school, needing rides and things like that. But it just was not a necessary part of our lifestyle and hasn't been so far.
Katherine, I just want to say thank you. I do have to hop off right now, but I'm really looking forward to watching this recording afterwards. And I would have had many more questions to ask you, but thank you again so much. And I will see you guys later. Bye-bye.
So still lots more to chat about. First of all, thank you for those nuances, right? So it's not all black or white. I love the fact that, you still have the Apple ID, but it's in a common area, right? That makes a big difference.
Mm-hmm.
And the second part, not on the person, right? The thing about the smartphone is that it's always on you, right? And you have people that actually have measured that your concentration lessens when you have the smartphone even around you. And so imagine on you. and that people start to have anxiety when the battery runs low, right? So those are actually right. So when you mentioned before, as a parent, I go out without the phone. That's something that you can model, and I think most people would love to go out without the phone more often. I do as well. I go for walks or other things without the phone, and it's maybe sometimes challenging to some at first because what again, fear of missing out, but you're more present, right? And when you talked about the environment that's communal, that the brothers and parents can also, the whole family can see that, it prevents from, I think, something else I saw in your book, which was the three P's: porn, Pokemon, and Pythagoras, all in the same device, right? And it goes more, and I have a philosophy of 8 P's that we chatted about, and I saw a lot of them in your books, right? Presence, perseverance, play, purpose, and all those things are better than what's online, right? And can we talk a little bit more about play? I know you mentioned it already. We can talk about the difference between unsupervised and supervised play, and also in terms of sports. People think sometimes sports is good play, but it's organized play, right? So what are the differences, and what do you think you need in play that people might not know or remember?
Hmm. Well, play is what children have evolved to do. I mean, that is how children learn. It's how they grow. For, since the dawn of humankind, children have played and played and played. And that is obviously, so I talked about how that's how they develop their fine and gross motor skills. I interviewed a pediatric occupational therapist for my book who talked about how kids she's seeing are developing all these strange aberrations in their physical abilities that were very rare in the past, like kids unable to manipulate small objects, kids who lack physical strength to hang from monkey bars, who can't stand on one foot, who can't do a somersault, falling randomly out of their chairs onto the floor. They just can't balance their bodies in space, and it's really alarming. And they attribute this to a lack of free play, primarily outdoors. And kids, like I said, they also learn communication skills. They learn those interpersonal skills in a low stakes environment when it's happening with kids of mixed ages. I talk a lot actually about play in my upcoming book and how important it is for kids of different ages to play, because older kids will always sort of tailor their play to the ability of the younger ones, and the younger ones will try to rise to the level of ability of the older ones. And it's just this wonderful enmeshing of different ability levels in communication, and it challenges the young ones, and it also challenges the older ones to pay attention to what the little ones can do. So it's just really, really great for kids to do that. And yet now, fewer and fewer kids have opportunities to play like that because they are, kind of segregated into their age groups according to their grades. They're out at recess, heavily supervised by teachers, getting in trouble if they do the slightest thing. My son came home from school one day and was complaining about how he'd gotten in trouble for picking up snow. And I said, "What are you talking about?" And he said, "Well, apparently we're not supposed to pick up the snow. The snow stays on the ground because they might turn it into a snowball and then throw it at someone, and they could get hurt." So just these rules that, I mean, I guess I sort of understand where they're coming from, but you cannot, like, that's just unrealistic. That's insane. I don't think that you can micromanage children's play to that extent without starting to sort of reap the costs of that, which we are seeing in a lot of kids nowadays. So I am a proponent of free play. I know that free play en- enhances children's physical development more than organized sports does, which is quite interesting. There's actually higher rates of injury in organized sports than there are in children's free play. Kids become stronger, faster, healthier in general than when they're playing supervised by adults. Kids also need that sense of agency. It takes, on average, I think 40 to 45 minutes for a group of children to come up with an imaginary game of their own and lay out all of the rules and assign roles and figure out what the punishments are if someone breaks those rules. And kids get so lost in the best possible way in those imaginary worlds. Whereas if an adult is orchestrating the play and telling when a kid has to, leave and come back in and all of these things, the kids lose interest because they're not invested in it one bit. And I think that some organized sports and various activities can be beneficial in a child's life to a certain extent, especially if you are going through a replacement phase and trying to get rid of the devices in a child's life and fill their time in more productive, active ways. But it cannot dominate a child's schedule. And right now we're hearing about, North American kids' schedules just being notoriously jam-packed with organized activities to the point where they have no time to play anymore. And so I want to bring back opportunities for, free play. I think that families can implement that in their own homes. They can send their kids outside. I did that a lot when my kids were younger. I'd say you have to be outside for an hour. I'm setting a timer. They would come to the door and I'd say, no, your time isn't up yet. You have to go find something to do. Dinner won't be ready for another 30 minutes. That's when you can come in. And they would grumble and they would complain. And inevitably, though, they'd find something to do. And often their time would extend beyond the timer. The timer would go. I wouldn't go call them. Of course, if they're having fun, I would just leave them, but then they'd come back in eventually. So I think that that's important. I had a yard, which made it easier. There's some interesting work being done by the Let Grow Foundation, run by my friend Lenore Skenazy, and she advocates for the creation of Let Grow play clubs, especially if you live in urban areas where you cannot let your children outside to play. You don't have a yard. Maybe there's a lot of traffic. It might not be a safe neighborhood. So Let Grow Play Club is sort of administered by the school, and it's before and after playtime that happens on the playground, but it's only loosely supervised by a teacher or an older teen. So the parents essentially, sign an agreement recognizing that their kid is not being supervised that closely, but obviously they're safe. They're within this contained space and they're playing with lots of kids. Screen-free time, there's no devices allowed, and the kids just play. And what I've heard from some principals who I've met at schools that have implemented this program is that it has transformed the children who attend it, especially the kids who struggle with behavioral problems. Some of the kids that, have to have EAs with them throughout the day. Those kids, on the days that they attend play club before class, report no behavioral incidents or issues throughout the day. And their caregivers are begging for play club to be implemented every single day of the week. So we know that kids who play are just calmer. They are happier. They're more well adjusted. They get that energy out. They're feeling just a lot more grounded in the world and in their bodies than kids who are deprived of that. And it makes sense evolutionarily. Like I said at the beginning, that's how we evolved to grow and develop. And if we take that away from kids and just expect them to entertain themselves by lying on a couch looking at a tiny rectangle in their hands, it is not going to be as optimal an experience for them as if they're out in the world.
We're a big proponent of Lenore and Let Grow and free play in general. So thanks for sharing some of the details. We've done some research as well. We're working with schools and trying to educate parents as well. There's some interesting stats from your first book. One of them is that 2/3 of 10 years old have never been alone to a convenience store or a park, right? At 10, that's very old to do that. Some people can do that at 4 or 5. And there's still this stigma, coming perhaps from the media, social media, of fear, right? And how can you help parents understand that the fear is unjustified, and that not only is it unjustified, it's not helping the kids? I also saw there was a New Zealand study that implemented no rules in the courtyard at school, and they had less injury and more concentration, right? You mentioned also sports. So all this idea that we're going to make kids safer and better by not letting them go out alone, by making sure that they're not hurt because we're watching them. What can we think, and what have you heard of schools and parents implementing that, and how do they switch their mindset to say, okay, let's try it?
I'll just quickly respond to the New Zealand school. Yeah, I did write about that in my book. And there was one kid, I think, who broke his arm on the playground, and he and his father went to the principal and begged the principal not to change the rules at the school, because he said, it doesn't matter that I broke my arm. It's not your fault. It's something that happened. But the whole program was just seen as so enormously successful that the family didn't want to undermine it in any way. So I thought that's just really delightful. So regarding the fear question, yeah, I mean, that's a huge question. And I've actually had conversations with Lenore about this directly, because we're friends. She's an absolutely hilarious. She's the funniest woman I think I've ever met. I feel like I'm always laughing whenever I spend time with her. She's wonderful. So Lenore has said that stats do not really work. You can counter parental
Yeah.
fear with the craziest statistics in the world, and it really does not address that issue. I still try. I mean, in my talks, I love to um, cite the statistic that if for any reason you actually wanted your child to be kidnapped by a stranger in a white van who, drives by and nabs them, you would have to leave your child outside unattended for, on average, 750,000 years in order for that to be statistically viable. So it's really not going to happen. And your kid's far more likely to be struck by lightning and more likely to, die in a house fire, all these things, than ever, get captured by a stranger driving by. So really the fear thing, statistically, you can't argue away parental fear. It is hardwired into us. Of course, it's like our worst nightmare to imagine something terrible happening to our child like that. The best way to counter it, Lenore explained to me, is to instill in yourself as a parent a belief in your child's ability to function and move independently in the world. So the more your child does on their own, and the more you see your child doing things on their own, the more confident you will feel letting them go, because you will increase your own sense of confidence. You'll know that they are self-assured, that they can handle themselves, and that is probably the most reassuring cure for this fear that can be quite crippling. How do you do that? How do you train that? Well, I know that the Let Grow organization offers its Let Grow Experience project. It administers it often through schools, where kids will make lists of independent activities that they would like to try that they've never done before. And they go home, they talk to their parents. Like, it might be making a meal, or going to the corner store by themselves, or walking to a friend's house on their own, or biking to school independently, anything like that. And then they can report it back to their teacher as having accomplished it. And, it's sort of made to be this event, something that's worthy of celebration. So that's one thing, especially if the parent's really struggling. There's a great resource through Outdoor Play Lab, which is an organization. It's a lab that studies free play at UBC, administered by Mariana Brusoni. And there's sort of an online questionnaire that parents can walk through themselves, and caregivers, that addresses some of their fears and challenges them, and basically says, remember what your favorite childhood memories were. And were adults present there? Probably not. You were likely outside playing alone with other kids. So it sort of helps to recalibrate a parent's perspective on what is normal. I personally, so with my three boys, I would often spend time walking and biking around town, and I would have them be the leader. So I would say, you tell me when it's time to cross the street. You tell me when it's safe to go. And of course I would intervene if I needed to, but I rarely did. I felt that they practiced, and they got quite good at saying, okay, there's no cars, or the light has turned green, we can go. And so that helped establish confidence in me, in their ability to do that. The other thing I advocate for might come as a bit of a surprise, but it is to talk to strangers. I think it's incredibly important for kids to learn how to talk to strangers. Lenore talks about this too. She says talking to strangers is good, going off with strangers is not. And there is a very clear distinction between those two. And kids are smart. Kids are old enough and mature enough. Well, they're smart enough to be able to distinguish between the two, the difference between talking to a stranger and going off with a stranger. And so I've always maintained that the more people a child talks to, the more adept they will become at reading body language and sensing intent. They'll be able to tell who's a nice seeming person and who's a creepy person. If your child has never, communicated with anyone other than you, how are they going to learn that? A child who can talk to strangers is a child who has potential helpers around them. So that if they get lost or get into a sticky situation and you're not around, they will know how to approach someone to ask for help. So my kids have done this. I had one scary moment, actually. I was in the parking garage at the Eaton Center, big shopping mall downtown Toronto, and the elevator door opened. I had my three kids with me. My husband and my middle son, who was about 11 at the time, ran into the elevator, and the door closed, and he was gone. And I remember standing there for a moment thinking, we're in the biggest shopping mall downtown Toronto, in this parking garage with many, many levels. We didn't even have a plan. He didn't know where we were going. He didn't have a phone. Like, I didn't know what was going to happen. My husband jumped in another elevator saying he was going to look for him, and just left. And so then I was standing there with two kids. I didn't know what to do. So I just waited. And after a few minutes, the doors opened again, and out emerged my son. And he was there with a woman, an older woman, who shouted at me. She said, "Don't worry. I told him I'm a mom with a couple of kids. He asked me for help, and I said I wasn't going to leave him on his own until, until we found his family. So, he came out, he was totally calm. He was fine. He kind of apologized and was maybe a bit embarrassed, but I was so relieved that he just looked for a nice person to talk to and asked for help, and she helped him. So, that was kind of that training in practice, which is always reassuring as parents.
I love those insights and specific experience I can share as well. I've been doing that with my son, who waved at strangers since he's 2 or 3. And actually, talking about judgment of other parents or sometimes grandparents, I remember that I was teaching my son to be okay with strangers. I was actually also doing couch surfing, which is including having
Mm.
strangers come in your home. So he was used to strangers.
Mhm.
And one day, my mom rang the bell, and my son was old enough to run and try to open the door. And she said, "Why are you letting your son, open the door to strangers?" Said, "I'm teaching him different, right? I want him to be
Mhm.
okay with strangers." And as you said, when you know the statistics, there is very little chance that the strangers will do something bad, and they can sense it. The children are smarter and safer than you think. We do digital reset, audio guidance. And in my last reset, I talked about this: smarter and safer than you think to parents, because we always want to protect them, but they can protect themselves. They know danger more than we think, right? And another story is that later my son got used to talking to strangers, and when I went to just him and me in a trip in Ushuaia in Patagonia in Argentina,
Mhm.
when we arrived, I asked him to find us a hotel. He was 12. We didn't have a hotel. So he went in the airport. He asked. He got the cab. He asked. He found. He negotiated the price, and he found us the hotel, right? And just to give them that ability, eventually the fourth day we had a big hike in the morning. Like, "Oh, Dad, I'm hungry." I was packing for the hike, and I said, "Okay, you know where the store is? Go alone and in a foreign city." He speaks Spanish, so that's good. And then after a while, he was not coming back, and I was ready, and the van was coming, and he got lost. So he was
Yeah.
late. And then he said, "Oh, Dad, I'm sorry, I got lost. I was sleepy." But then I realized we were in this direction, and I asked a taxi. "I'm sorry, I'm a kid. Can you bring me for free?" My dad said that I can. Right? And right, so that's like it's building those experiences and that
Mm.
confidence from the kid's perspective and for the parents' perspective as well. To say,
Mhm.
do a small step, not go at the end of the city without supervision, but it was a few blocks, or do things and I'm here behind you, but you're doing them right. So I think building that trust is very important. And thank you for your examples.
Yeah, it made me think of something else, which is that we work so hard. We should be working very hard to establish this sense of independence and trustworthiness out in the world. But I think that when we introduce a smartphone in the name of safety, which is often why many parents buy their child a smartphone initially, it undermines a lot of those lessons that we've worked so hard to teach. So I often think of this story that I heard from a mother in Vancouver at a talk that I was giving. And she told me about her 2 teenage daughters who ride public transit every single day in Vancouver on the SkyTrain, I think it's called, and they don't have smartphones. And these two girls told their mother that they are hyper alert to the presence of creepy strangers in around them, wherever they may be, whether they're on the train or waiting at a bus stop or something like that. And they keep their distance if they feel that anyone is getting too close. But what they're more worried about is all of the kids around them who are standing there with their eyeballs glued to a screen, their,
Mm,
earbuds in, and they are completely checked out from whoever's in the vicinity, and they have no idea who's around them. They won't hear someone approach. They're just, oblivious to what's going on. And so it leads to this question of who is safer in that scenario. Is it the kids who don't have the phone, who cannot call their parent, but are relying on this ancient neural circuitry to be able to detect and avoid danger before it arrives? Or is it the kids who can hypothetically call a parent, what, like after something terrible has happened to them? And I don't know about you, but I very much would rather have a child who is alert and paying attention, aware of what's happening, isn't tempted by a phone while they're crossing a street, isn't tempted to text me back or call someone else while they're driving a car. Like, these phones are often, like I said, touted as um, bearers of safety in a child's life, but they pose all these other risks and really pull kids into situations that are less than ideal.
Thanks. Yeah, that's a wonderful story as well. And from your book, for those who haven't had the chance, Childhood Unplugged, which I really enjoyed. There's another story that I really liked, which is a 6 and 10-year-old in the U.S. that go many states on a horse and sleep in hotels on their own. 6 and 10 years old, right? And that was a few decades ago, and now people are afraid. Two-third cannot go to a few blocks away, right?
Yeah, that story I told to just basically illustrate what a young child is capable of. We treat 6 and 10-year-olds sometimes like they're babies, and yet, there's so many examples, wonderful, like sort of shocking examples too. That pair of brothers who rode horses halfway across the United States on something like a 6-week journey to go meet the president in New York City. It's such a delightful, kind of heartwarming story. No doubt it was very challenging too, but I do think that we need to expect more of our children too, to a certain extent. And I've made jokes like we should bring back child labor in the home, and obviously I'm saying that tongue in cheek. But
Yeah.
I do think that when we are looking at the extensive number of hours that kids are spending on their devices for entertainment-based purposes only, some of that time could be reallocated toward constructive purposes and being useful around the house. So I'm very much pro getting kids doing more chores again, having them pitch in with yard work and cooking and cleaning, caring for pets, doing all of these things that right now a lot of parents are feeling overloaded by, and are sort of hesitant to give to their kids because they feel like their kids should be focusing on other things or just relaxing and having fun. But in fact, we are depriving children of opportunities and to learn these practical skills. What we're also seeing in the research is that a lot of young adults are moving out, and they're crippled with extreme anxiety over just having to be an adult. They're overwhelmed with the responsibility that goes along with that. Many lack the practical skills to take care of themselves, to prepare food, to do their laundry, to pay their bills, to have confrontational or difficult conversations with a landlord or with a professor about a mark they didn't like. And so I very much advocate for training these skills starting from day one. It's cumulative. Your kid's not going to wake up at age 18 knowing how to handle themselves in the world. You do have to make a conscious, deliberate effort as a parent to start teaching those lessons from a young age and build on them, and be constantly giving your child more and more responsibility, to the point where when they move out, it's a very natural transition for the kid. And you're also making your own life easier as a parent, to be quite honest. I think that ideally, and it doesn't always work out this way in my own life, I recognize that, but ideally my life should be getting easier in some ways, practical ways around the house. And I would say it is. I can delegate meal prep and cooking and different laundry assignments to my kids when I need to. So I would encourage parents not to overlook that as not just a practical aid and a practical skill builder, but also a way to fill that void that is left when you're trying to get kids off of devices and figure out other things for them to do.
Very, very good. We'll call it child labor-ish. And I love it. But yeah, chores and responsibility. Um, Kids can cook quite early and can use sharp knives and can use
Mhm.
blenders. And right, I was remembering. I put my hand on the stove when I was a kid, and I got burned.
Mhm.
Then I stopped. I put a fork in the electric plug.
Ooh.
And I didn't do it again, right? So yeah, like we do those things, and then we remember them when we're parents, but sometimes we don't, and we're like, okay, well, no, 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 no. That's what we need to do to grow. Of course, you don't have to not look at your child and let them do everything at every age. There's age appropriate things, but I do think that giving them autonomy and is gradual, as you mentioned, right? And first time, perhaps you have the kitchen knife and you're with them, and then or it's not so sharp, and then slowly you look at them from further, and they can do that, right? So a lot of things that you mentioned is also building skills, and also building their not only emotional resilience, but I'm a very big in giving tips on happiness, and don't every part want their kids to be happy. So when you're doing those tasks, you're also giving them the opportunity to learn how to be happy to do a task that they don't like, or to learn to do things that is difficult, right? So we want kids, every human beings need challenges to grow. And for instance, you can turn the chores into a fun thing, right? Hey, let's dance while we do the laundry, or the dishes. Let's sing. Let's do something fun. Let's change our mindset, and let the kids build that, so that no situation becomes so bad that they're building those anxiety, depression. They're building emotional regulation skills. They're building cognitive behavioral skills to change their mindset to be happier, right?
Hmm. Yeah, I would agree with that. That I think a child who feels helpless is going to be a scared child, and that's going to be a child that is racked by anxiety because they don't know how to handle the hardships that are inevitable in their lives. There's going to come a point when their parent is not there to, clear the path for them and, negotiate every single challenge that arises. And so we really do our children a tremendous favor by preparing them for those difficulties in their lives.
So we were connected through Rogers, who launched a small documentary about teenage use. I saw it, and I think the kids and parents were a little bit shocked of the behavior of their kids using the phone all day, many, many, many hours. I think that one of them was close to 12 hours. What did you think about that? Did you relate to that? Have you heard stories? Probably not in your home, which is great, but what have you seen?
So I thought the documentary did a good job of illustrating a scenario that's just all too familiar to many Canadian parents these days. It obviously, it followed these three different teenagers throughout their day. There was a film crew that was filming them to get a sense of how much time they're spending on their devices. And it interviewed the parents before the film was made and after the film was made. And the film includes the footage of the parents watching their kids being filmed throughout the day and really getting a glimpse of how much time their kids are spending online. So you're it's a very uncomfortable watch, I have to say. I was sort of squirming as I was watching it, feeling like, oh, this is really awkward. These poor parents are really being kind of put on the spot, and being filmed while being confronted with the reality of just how much time their kids are squandering on their phones. So it was an interesting take on it. Like, you don't often think about looking at it from that angle. And the daily screen time amounts were quite shocking. They ranged, I think, from 6 to 9 to 13 hours or something like that, which are on, that's the average. It's
Yep.
right on track with the numbers that I quoted before and that we're seeing in a lot of the research. What I think is most impactful for me, though, was just watching those parents' reactions and how uncomfortable the parents were when confronted with this fact. And I think that a lot of parents don't want to confront that. Part of me was surprised that the parents were so surprised. I mean, I felt like, how can you not know that your kids are spending this much time on their phones? Like, you're their parent. You are engaging with them all day, every single day. You should know what's going on. And I don't know if it's just they're in a state of denial, or maybe they're just really busy and they're not paying attention. I know that we have a lot going on as parents, but it also is this is serious. And I think that I feel there's a time for urgency at this point. And people sometimes critics will say, oh, this whole debate around phones is being made out to be some kind of huge moral panic that's overblown. But I actually think we need a great deal more moral panic about this whole conversation, because this is kids' well-being. It's their kids, it's their lives that are on the line at this point. And this is not something that we should be taking lightly. And so I think that the film, I hope it stirs up strong enough emotions in families that watch it to cause them to reevaluate their kids' relationships with phones, to sit down with their kids and revisit the rules surrounding screen time at home. And this is, again, is at the core of my message to parents, which is that you can claw it back. You can say no. You can sit your kid down and have really tough conversations with them that you're not comfortable with how things are going. And I often offer scripts to parents. So I'll say, like, you can sit your kid down and say, I made a mistake. I didn't know what I didn't know 2, 3, 5 years ago when I first let you have this thing, but now I do. And there's so much more research that's coming in that you can feel equipped. You can feel armed with this research to go to your kid and say, look, this is just out. This is what's happening to your brain and to your emotional development. I can no longer stand by quietly and passively and let this happen to you. I would be failing you as a parent if I just let this go. So I think that's a big part of it. You can say to your kid, social media is just not an option right now. I know that's not what you want to hear. But you're going to get over it. We're going to get through this, and maybe you can have it at some point down the road, but now is not the time. You could say, like I said, I've learned this new thing about an app or a behavior. We're going to be revisiting the rules surrounding screen time at home. You don't have to like it. This is just how it is. So those are tough conversations to have, but I think that they are necessary. There's some interesting movements too. Actually, I often will direct parents to this organization called abstinence.org, APP. Abstinence, kind of a cute name. And it's a group of university students out of Harvard that are starting to advocate for this social media free life and saying we don't need addictive technology to dominate our social networks and our lives. And they're just rejecting it fully. They refuse to use it. And they also have a 5D method for getting off of social media. So if you have a kid who's pretty deeply entrenched in it, how they can reduce, and like, I can't remember what all the D's are, but like deactivate, diminish, delete, different things like that. And so that can be a good tool for kids who are pretty far gone down that social media rabbit hole if they're looking for a hard reset. So, I mean, the way that parents can approach it is going to vary. Maybe it's possible to just reduce the amount of screen time that your kid is having, give them a simpler device, perhaps, maybe just get them off social media and let them still have their smartphone, prevent them from taking it into their bedroom. There's all kinds of options that you can work with, but definitely that documentary film highlighted the need for stronger limits and rules in the home in order to affect some real change.
Well, thanks for sharing all those resources and your insight. Yes, I think the angle of the documentary was really to focus on the parents. There's a brief talk between the parents and child or teen that kind of shows some shock, but also some love and compassion. But there needs to be those conversation, and I think emotionally that documentary did a good job. In terms of science, I think there is that type of denial that you mentioned. Mark and I started I'm sorry, AWE or A 2 years ago with that science. Mark studied that specifically. Then we both studied and invited many guests. Um, I found some studies in Montreal. I think it's not Université de Montréal, but UQAM, that did a 15-year studies. So it's not recent studies, longitudinal 15-year studies that showed that exposure to screens lead to screen addiction and other addiction, right? In 15 years. There's a correlation that we know, and that's with the social media and screens that were 15 years ago. So imagine Snapchat and TikTok today, and the better algorithms, right? So there are some even old science, even before Jonathan Haidt, some of the findings that he found with smartphone correlation and mental health, anxiety, depression, that we all recommend. Also the anxious generation. There's so much mounting and compounding evidence, and there's probably reason why some people don't want to talk about it, and some parents don't want to feel the shame and guilt. But it's not about shaming and guilting. It's about being aware, right? Raising awareness and giving tools and solutions, like the resources that you mentioned, like the resources that we have at AW. We have the digital reset. We have the smartphone. I remember I did a workshop at the University of Concordia, and one of the attendee was telling us that he could not believe that as a undergrad university student, he had to spend some time with his friends, 1 or 2 hours, while they were all on their phone and no one was talking. And he's like, what? I'm the only one that finds this weird. And that became the reality also at the university level, right? So, and that probably comes from having the phone earlier and having this normalized, right? So those are real stories that some people are aware and some are not. And it would be better if we're all in the same, at least awareness. Then you can make your choices, but don't deny that things are happening. Like perhaps some parents, teachers, government have been in the past. But we're seeing some positive change, right?
We are, yeah, maybe not quite as quickly as I would like to see it, but there are some changes that are starting to occur. I've seen some hopeful changes in the school systems. I think that that's where I'm seeing a lot of progress, particularly in the United States. So I visited a few high schools. I give a lot of talks around the US and Canada, but I was in the US in New York State, and the governor of New York State brought in a law last September to create a bell-to-bell phone ban for all students. So kids do not have access to their phones from the start of the day to the end of the school day. And this has completely transformed these schools. And a couple of the principals said that it's just made their schools so much better to deal with, and the kids seem a lot happier. So, yeah, I'm seeing some shifts there. I am starting to see shifts on a personal level. I mean, I meet a lot of parents who obviously are holding out, not giving their kids phones till at least 16. I met a mother a couple weeks ago who said she still hasn't given her 18-year-old a phone, but I'm sure she'll get it once she leaves home. But, talking about how it's a hard fight and it can feel really lonely because the parents who are not letting their kids have phones and be super active on social media are often not the ones crowing about it on social media and making it really obvious to the world to know about it. So it's not really their brand or anything. It's just this quiet thing that they're doing in their own life. And so obviously there's power in numbers, that when you can find a community, when you can find others who align with that way of living, with that philosophy, it can make it a lot easier. But it can be challenging to find those people. I feel lonely in this mission. I mean, I am exposed to a lot of people when I travel, but even within my own community, I don't know a lot of people that are delaying their kids' phone ownership. I think my 16-year-old was the last in his friend group to get a phone, and had been for years. I mean, he was kind of the odd one out at that point. And it's not an easy road to choose, but I do think that it's an important one.
Well, I think it's also modeling. I never had a Facebook or Instagram account, so that's easier to say, hey,
Wow.
that is not doing that. So,
Yeah, good for you.
and in terms of New York, there's a parallel here in Quebec. So last September, it's almost going to be a year that they have the school ban here as well. I'm still doing some talks here. There is still some issues, so I want to let the schools, the parents, and the legislation know that that's only one step, right? So you're doing a great thing because in the learning time, the kids don't have phone, and that shows progress, as you mentioned, in New York and in Quebec. Yet I'm still talking to teenagers here that are using the phone after
Hmm.
school or before school or at 2 a.m. with their
Hmm.
second Instagram or Snapchat account. So I think that the ban is a good start and it's the right direction. We still need to keep that awareness and resources going to say this is a problem that parents, teachers, everyone is using probably the phone too much, and they would admit that. And how can we start to give tools? And now there's AI as well, right? So
Hmm.
AI for fun or for therapy or for doing homework. How can we give tools to those children to use technology? Because we're not against technology, in a right way. We might be against technology at the table, at school, in the bedroom, but it's useful. We just need to help them have the right information about what it can do, what it cannot do, and where it might lead your cognition, your emotional regulation, which are all linked to phone use, right? So, do you see, for instance, in your children or other families that have less phone use or no phone use, that they can regulate their emotion better, that they can read books longer, they have more attention? Can you share more of the benefits that balance or that control helps?
Yeah, I mean, those are certainly well documented benefits. I've read about them in many studies and books about how if kids can train their attention spans to attend to, bigger, more complex chunks of information, like it's a muscle. Focus is a muscle that you have to develop, and you have to train it and practice it over and over and over again in order to become better at it. And if you persist at it, you will become quite good at it. That's why reading a book can feel intensely uncomfortable if you're not used to it, if you're just used to scrolling on your device. But if you stick with it and, read 5 pages a day and then read 10 pages a day, and, in a couple months time, you're going to be reading books cover to cover, no problem. It will take time, but it's just like training your physical body. So I've only lived really with my own kids. I can't speak for kids who maybe have screen addiction, but I do know that my kids do read a lot of books. They do other activities, and that's partly because that's just what they've grown up doing. It's how they see me acting around them. It's how I try to spend my free time instead of scrolling. And so they just copy, because that's what kids do. They imitate the parents that are around them. And also, I'm sure that their brains in many ways have been protected through limiting that exposure from a young age. So yeah, I do think that there's a lot of real science to support that. You mentioned the school bans, and I would love to go back to that really quickly, because I think that there's a lot of discussion about the importance of these phone bans. But what's sort of unfortunate is that they've been rolled out so piecemeal in different places around the world. There's so many different interpretations, and I think especially here in Ontario, our Ministry of Education acted all excited about a phone ban they were bringing in, but really it made no difference whatsoever based on the conversations I've had with teachers that I know, as well as my own kids, because kids are still allowed to carry phones on their person, in the upper grades. And that doesn't really deter kids from looking at their phones. As we know, kids are incredibly sneaky. All they have to do is go to the bathroom, or they can just break down a teacher who's too exhausted to be able to push back against it anymore. So I feel sorry for teachers having to police phone use in the classroom. I don't think that it should be their job. And I think it's incredibly unfair for parents to send something to school with their kids that they know impairs their child's ability to learn, and then be angry when the school doesn't do a good enough job at limiting its use and its access. So I think we are asking too much of our teachers. That's why I would like to see a full bell-to-bell phone ban, where kids are physically separated from their devices from the start of the day to the end of the day. Even beyond that, ideally would be to include also extracurricular activities that happen before and after school. So I have heard of schools that don't give the phones back until 6 o'clock at night, once the kids are done their team practices. So I think that's what we should be doing. To me, that's an absolute no-brainer. I'm reading a fantastic book right now called The Digital Delusion by Jared Cooney Horvath, who's an academic neuroscientist as well as a teacher, who really creates this scathing expose of educational technology and how it has basically destroyed kids' capacity to learn effectively in the last decade or two. So I think that that's a real call to action that I hope changes this conversation and spurs schools to take some serious action. I also would love to see schools come up with some other ideas. So things that I say, for example, we talk a lot about the ban, but what about things like not using social media for any form of vital communications for extracurricular groups? So for example, students will sign up for, soccer, for the volleyball club or the basketball team, or for band, or for the drama club, whatever it may be, which are great activities to do to fill their time after school if they're spending too much time on their phone. Like it fills that void in a really healthy social kind of way. But often those groups will then create a Snapchat group or an Instagram account to be able to communicate. And it puts so much pressure on those families that may have been holding out, but now their grade 9 kid is coming home and saying, I have to be part of this group. I have to get Snapchat. And I wish that the school would just say, you can't use social media for any school sanctioned extracurricular activity. You can use alternative things, like maybe a WhatsApp chat can work. I know it's still kind of social media-ish, but it doesn't have the algorithmic news feed. A Google document, a Google spreadsheet. I don't know exactly what the solution is here, but we surely do not need to be using social media for that. So that's one thing that I would do for sure. I also would like to see a decrease in the presence of QR codes in class. I don't know what it's like in Quebec, but here in Ontario, often the teachers will put a QR code on the board and expect the kids to scan it with their phones to pull up their homework assignments that night. So it spares teachers having to print out all of the worksheets. But again, that puts unnecessary pressure on families to give their kids smartphones and then to bring them into the classroom to be able to scan those QR codes. So again, I have a personal story with that, because one of my sons, when he was in grade 9, there was a visiting speaker that came to the class and asked all the kids to scan the QR code to fill out a survey when he was done. And my son was the only one in the class who couldn't, because he didn't have a smartphone. And he was sort of outed in that moment, because he'd hidden the fact that he didn't have a smartphone from everyone up until that point. As kids do, they're not really going to boast about it to everyone. And the only way I found out about it was because his teacher called me that night to apologize for the teasing that ensued. They said that people were pretty merciless and mean. And when I spoke to my son, who's usually a very calm, confident kid, he just broke down in tears because he found it so distressing. So again, things like that, I think that it's important for the educational system to consider the incentives that they are creating, maybe inadvertently. I'm not saying it's malicious by any means, but they could be pushing parents to force them to adopt these technologies much earlier than they would like. Oh, and one final point I'll make about that is I'd love to see schools just issue a statement of support for families that choose to wait. It doesn't even have to be an explicit school policy, but just to say we applaud all efforts by families to delay smartphone ownership until, let's say at least age 16, and not to let their kids on social media also until at least the age of 16. So, there's a lot of scientific evidence to back that up. This is not an arbitrary statement. But it would just make people feel a little bit more empowered, I think, in the choices that they're making, instead of feeling like they're the odd one out.
So much great suggestions, and I agree with all of them, Katherine. There's so much nuance that we should be thinking about, not just a ban, as you mentioned. I like the idea of being forced to be on groups as something to think about. I do have some research that shows that WhatsApp direct messages or even group messages are much better than other social media platform because there's no like and swipe. So those direct message are not as good as face-to-face interaction, but much less harmful than others. So that's, if you have to do it, please consider direct messages and not a full social media group like Facebook or others. In terms of what can we do, and we're talking about this, and thank you for again doing this like we did for years, and continuing the awareness. It's not a fight. It's not something that we have to go against. It's more that we want to give awareness so that people are enabled to do that on themselves. One second. I am terribly sorry, Katherine. What are the things that you think parents should do? We talked about government and schools. What are the things that you think parents should do more this year and in the coming years?
Do you mean regarding the role of phones in schools specifically?
Yes.
Well, I would say don't send a phone to school with your kid. And that might seem difficult. It might seem like a tall order, but I would challenge you to actually think this through. I mentioned before the necessity for promoting independence in our children. And, if you send a phone with your kid, is that really that your kid needs it, or is it just that you think that you need to stay connected to your kid? And smartphones have been described as the world's longest umbilical cord for good reason. They tether the child to the parent, and that's not fair to the child. And the parent should really maybe turn the lens on themselves a little bit and do some self-examination as to why it is that they feel that they need to communicate with their child throughout the entire day. So, use it as an exercise in independence to let your kid go to school without you being able to reach them, trust them to come home by a certain time, and know that you can trust the school with your child. Obviously, you do if you're sending them there, and there will be established protocols to call the school and to be able to get a hold of your child if you really need to. And I would challenge parents too who are struggling with that in particular to look at some of the research. And you mentioned it briefly at one point earlier in this talk about how the mere presence of a phone can detract from a person's ability to have a good conversation, or from their ability to focus and to think clearly. And the infamous brain drain study, of course, looked at how a phone that's face down or on silent, whether it's in a child's pocket or in a bag at their feet or in their desk, performed worse on a cognitive test than the kids whose phones were locked in a locker in a bag way down the hall, far away from them. And what that research showed is that we actually have to exert a fair amount of mental effort to avoid checking our phones. And, it's hard enough for us as adults to do that. It's even harder for kids to do that. So if you want your kid to thrive academically and to do the best they possibly can in school, don't let them have a phone. There's all kinds of things that we do not send to school with our kids because we understand that it will compromise their educational experience. Everything from, peanuts to drugs, alcohol, and weapons. Like there's all kinds of things that we just do not allow through the doors of the school because it makes their learning experience worse. So I would lump phones into that very, very broad category and just say, if you absolutely have to reach your kid, just give them a dumb phone, give them a flip phone, something that's so humiliating for them to pull out and show to anyone that they never will pull it out of their pocket, but at least it's there in an emergency. So I think that's one thing. Another interesting study replicated. Sorry, go ahead.
To agree on that, as you were saying, the school part, I would say, kids should not even go to school with phones, and that's the parents' part. But yeah, I agree 100% that they have been doing that for decades, centuries, and now the parents are fearing that something's going to happen to their child. But there's so many rules and things already in place in school. If your child doesn't show up, you'll get notified. I'm talking to a teacher later today. There are some things that are happening that you should trust, and you should trust yourself as a parent and also your children. So just wanted to reinforce that. I agree. What are some of the other things, Katherine?
I think I lost my train of thought on that topic, but I think that that was the biggest one for sure. Just to challenge that notion that the kids need to have the phones on them at all times throughout the school day.
And one thing that I also loved about your first book, and we can talk briefly about the new one that's coming out, dangerous play. Can you define dangerous play, and why do we need that? Or do children need that specifically?
Yeah, so dangerous play, also known as risky play, is sort of this particular category of play that challenges children in physical ways that holds the potential for risk, but doesn't necessarily lead to injury. They're the kinds of things that we adults might react quite strongly to and think, stop, don't do that. That's not safe. And yet it can be quite beneficial for kids. So a couple examples of those risky play categories would be playing at high speeds, playing with sharp objects, playing with fire, playing near water, playing in a location where they could get lost. So examples like, playing on the edge of a campsite, perhaps, where, if they disappear into the forest, they might not easily be able to find their way back to the campground. Playing with fire, kids sitting around a campfire, there's that primal instinct that we have to want to poke fires and set things on fire. Playing with sharp objects is, knives and different things like that. Whittling with sticks. Playing at high speeds, we're not advocating for motorized vehicles by any means, but if kids just use their own bodies to, go sledding, tobogganing down fast hills, to, race their bikes as fast as they can, these are all seen as really important ways, first of all, for children to push the limits of their physical bodies, and then they learn those limits in a setting that's less likely to hurt them than if they start doing it when they're older, under riskier circumstances. And it does, I think it gets it out of their system a little bit. A kid who's allowed to test those limits and do kind of slightly dangerous things when they're younger, I think is less likely to do it at the age of 16, 17, 18, 19, when they're getting into a car and driving really fast, because they know what it feels like to fall off their bike going down a hill really fast. But the consequences are much less when they're on the bicycle than when they're in the car. So that's just a little glimpse of what dangerous play is. And I think that as adults, we sometimes lose the ability to gauge danger and safety quite as adequately as our kids. Like, I think our kids, we can trust them to assess if they know that they're capable of something or not. And so I often will tell parents, instead of just, having your default response be, stop, don't do that, that's not safe. Maybe question your kid to say, like, test that branch. Do you think it can support your weight? Or, keep an eye out for, whatever that other thing it might be. Or, try to not just shut it down, but basically, or just let them be. There's this wonderful rule, again, from Mariana Brusoni. It's the 17-second rule. And she says, anytime you think that your kid is doing something unsafe, just stop and count to 17 and see if they're able to get themselves out of the situation on their own. And if they're not, then you can intervene. But for some reason, she has 17 as like this magical number, for the amount of time it takes for a kid to figure out what's actually going to happen. Because you don't want to jump in prematurely, because then they never learn the lesson that is, embedded in that particular physical experience.
Great advice. My son has this 30-second rule, which is when he feels bad, he learned to smile for 30 seconds. And when you keep the smile, the actual body will feel a little bit happier with the neurobiochemical beauty that we have and can activate physically and
Yeah.
body. Just wanted to give a little bit more emphasis. We talked a lot about how the phone is not perfect. We could do less of it. We talked about a lot of alternative, but I also wanted to say, like in your book, you have, board games, you have, camping, even in the house. There's so many things that you can do when you decide that the phone or there's other things that are not useful that you can classify as or not as useful. And then you allow not only the confidence, but after the boredom comes curiosity and then creativity, right? So those are also frameworks that I really like to use: creativity, curiosity, and when we can foster that in our children, then they can be as creative as they want and create their own games. You mentioned 45 minutes before kids get together and start to invent things, role playing, uh, creating, building things, breaking things, putting them back together. So just wanted to kind of reinforce for the audience that it's not only about not doing something, it's about giving space to do so much more, right?
And that brings me to another phrase, again, coined by Cal Newport, who I mentioned at the beginning. He's the one who came up with the digital minimalism idea. So yeah, he talks about fixing your analog life first. So setting yourself up for success and putting all of these things, and they might even be physical things, in place to be able to fill your child's time and attention when you take away the digital devices. So if you have a kid who's pretty far gone, addicted to their tablet, and you want to get rid of that tablet, you have to give them other things to do. And if they don't have other things to do, that will be a disaster. They will be completely aimless. You will be at your wit's end. You will have no idea what to do, and you'll just cave and give them back the tablet. So I talk about filling that void, which means filling your home with, you might need more toys. You might need more books and board games and puzzles and musical instruments and sporting gear and, costume box and craft supplies. Like all of those things might create more mess and chaos in your home, but that's not necessarily a bad thing. I think some parents need to get over the idea that they're going to live in an immaculate space if they have kids that are actively engaging in their home environments. So if that means leaving up the blanket fort that they built for several days or leaving out the train track that was built, you are inviting them into that sort of creative play for subsequent days, potentially, until they really truly lose interest, and then you can pack it up and put it away. But you will have gained as a parent all those hours of wonderful creative play that your child has been engaged in. So not to be afraid of that by any means. This can be hard, and every family is going to differ on how they enter that replacement phase. It does require a lot more work from the parent up front, especially if the child's not used to having that independent play. The parent may have to be a lot more involved even than they like initially. They may have to show the child how to do things, and over time kind of pull back and wean themselves off of the playtime a little bit, and then the child will get better at doing it on their own. It might require eliminating the screens completely. So you might have a kid who adapts easily and can just go down from like multiple hours of screen time to just half an hour a week or whatever it may be that you choose to allow. Some kids can't handle it. So one story I'll tell you is about a friend of mine whose son was completely addicted to his tablet, and his behavior would deteriorate. The father said he hated the child that his son became when he was using his tablet. And then he would take the tablet away and the son's behavior would improve, and he'd become so wonderful that he would ask for the tablet back, and the father would say, okay, here it is, you get it back, because you've been so good. And it was just this awful cycle of worsening and improving and worsening and improving. And finally, my friend one day, in a moment of desperation, took the tablet out into the backyard with his son, and they took a hammer to it, and the little boy and the father smashed the tablet. And they called it the smashing ceremony. And he said that from that day on, the son never asked for the tablet back because he had participated in its destruction. He knew it didn't exist. He knew his dad hadn't just stuck it in the closet somewhere and that it was still there. He'd actually witnessed it be ruined. And I'm not advocating, of course, for the widespread destruction of every device in your home, but that family needed it in that moment because it indicated in a very dramatic fashion the end of a chapter in that child's life. And the little boy was able to move on. He was able to then spend time jumping on his trampoline and doing other things. And it wasn't always easy by any means because it represented a pretty significant shift in how he had spent his time. But, think about addicts in general and what the drastic measures that you take in order to cut off a supply of whatever it is that you keep coming back for. Sometimes a family might need to do that, and also complement that with access to a lot more toys and things and other activities that can be done to fill that time.
Thanks for that wonderful destructive moment, but it is constructive in a way that it allowed them to move on. It allowed him to participate. Those stories are very helpful because there's different ways, and you mentioned it in your house. You were reading more, so we're not saying to parents, if you don't read, don't expect your kid to read. Maybe you can help them in some way. Maybe you can start to model a bit, go to the library, find things that they're interested in. But if you play music, if you dance, if you juggle, whatever you do that's not modeling being on the phone, do that or be creative yourself. So
Mhm.
be creative, find creativity with your children. And there's so many more things that you could do as well as a parent. That's why one of the reasons we're called AWE. It stands for awareness, wellness, and enjoyment, but it's also from my 4A's philosophy of awareness, acceptance, appreciation, and awe, right? And we're saying that the addictive behavior will decrease when you increase the awe moments, right? If
Mhm.
you had fun smashing that thing, then you're like, oh, actually, that was more fun than playing that thing, right? If you were outside and got a bruise, if you got lost, if you laughed with your friends after 40 minutes of boredom, then that's going to help you positive reinforcement instead of my parents really don't love me because they want me to be different and not have my phone, right? It's giving them
Mhm.
the opportunity to have those awe moments, those opportunity for discomfort, then challenge, then creativity, with always curiosity and compassion of sometimes it's tough and sometimes you have to be there with your son that got ridiculed because he didn't have a phone, he
Yeah.
got found out, right? So sometimes it's tough, but the general outlook, I think we've created a pretty happy families, and we're trying to help others that may be struggling with this aspect or others, emotional regulation, confidence, peer pressure, and saying we can create resilient kids that can use the phone at some point, but with better rules, because we know that without it, it's going to be very difficult and without things outside of the digital world to give them the opportunity to grow, to hike, to do sports, to go near water and fire, um, it might be more difficult. And the real danger might not be there where we think it is in the outside world. It might be letting them do that 7 to 10 hours a day.
Yeah. One thing I'll add too that I just think is relevant to this is that it gets easier. There's some really interesting research by a psychiatrist named Dr. Victoria Dunkley, who works out of Los Angeles area. She wrote a book called Reset Your Child's Brain, and she says that it takes 4 weeks to get digital devices out of a child's system. So there is this reset that needs to occur, and she will not diagnose a child with any kind of behavioral disorder or ADHD or anything like that until the child has had a minimum of a 4-week full fast from all electronics, both at home and at school, which is an incredibly difficult thing to do in our world today, as you can imagine. But the point is, this is a long-term game. You do have to stick with it as a parent. Don't give up hope if after a few days of your kid not having their iPad and being expected to just play, they're resistant, and they're struggling and they seem a little aimless. You do have to stick with it, and then you will see a transformation occur. It is this positive feedback loop where a kid who's not as stimulated is going to start sleeping better, and then they will feel better rested, and they will be happier, and then they'll be a little bit more creative and adventurous in the things that they do, and it just starts to build on itself, and over time you end up with a kid who's flourishing, and they're the optimal version of themselves instead of this somewhat emotionally stunted child that was so dependent on a device to get through the day. So I encourage parents to stick it out even when it's hard.
I so agree, and I'm sure that if our two teenagers hang out without phone, they'll be fine. And for other parents that still need help, resources, reach out to Katherine, or to the Odd Team. Um, Katherine, can you also let us know about your new book, which will be a new resource? What's the name, the theme, anything you can share?
Yeah, so it's called Hold the Phone: How Parents Can Rescue Their Kids from Too Much Screen Time, and it will be out this November. And it is very much leaning into this issue of parental authority, reclaiming parental authority that I mentioned before, and encouraging parents to feel like they have agency, they are capable of handling this. And while simultaneously advocating for, like I said, those higher level changes that we need, all of those things, like tightened up laws, things like Australia's minimum age requirement for social media, which is fantastic. The lawsuits that are holding tech companies accountable, school boards changing their rules, all of those things are really important, but they take a long time. And if there's one thing we know as parents, the days are long, but the years are short, and our kids need our help right now. And those laws, when they change, will help kids that are still really young, who are growing up and coming into this stage of their lives. But for the kids who are in the thick of it right now, they need their parents, they need their caregivers to come home, or to get off this podcast and sit down with them and basically say, we've got to change the rules. And I know I can do this as your parent. I know I am entitled to do this. I have the right to do this. I have the duty to do this. And so I'm looking at that, but in a very non-judgmental way, recognizing how difficult this is. I've just had so many parents though who say, give me permission to say no to my kid, and I say, yes, you have my permission. You don't really need it, but you have it, and it is something that you need to do. I also look more broadly at how we build a world that makes it easier to get our kids off screens. So when parents draw that line, what is there to support them? And I think that we need to look at how parents are relating to their kids. We need to look how families and households are handling it in a broader sense, and then out in our communities, in our neighborhoods, and what we are doing societally to support families that are trying to get kids off of their devices. I think about this a lot now from the perspective of teenagers, now that I have teens. And I think that even in terms of infrastructure, we build so much for young kids to be out in the world playing. Think of, splash pads and playgrounds and all of the
Yeah.
things that we give to toddlers, preschoolers, and young elementary aged kids. But as soon as you're age, 12 and up, there's very little for you to do. There's some skate parks, which are good, but not every kid is into skateboarding. We need to be asking ourselves, where are the third places? Where are the teen friendly playgrounds that challenge them sufficiently? Give them things to do, give them places to go, places to gather where they don't have to spend money. No one's harping on them about, the chaos that they create, because teenagers can be kind of noisy and, take risks and different things like that. So I do think that we have this sort of bigger responsibility as a society to create structural changes that invite kids to get off their phones and make them feel like they're welcome in our communities.
Now that I think about it, maybe that's how they created parkour, or climbing and jumping off building, because they don't have the real space, so they had to invent, right?
That's an excellent suggestion.
So thanks for the insight. I do, again, and we talked about this before, think that community is how we're gonna get to this, right? Because one family is doing it, one school is doing it, but we need actually proximity. Yes, we can have online community. Yeah, yes, we can keep our friendship, Katherine, and when you're in Montreal, we'll have real time together. But start close, start with people around, ask around, raise awareness, and say, hey, could we have a few parents that let the kid, like you mentioned, go to the park in one parent
Mhm.
supervised, or in one parent's backyard. Small things like that. One of my first podcasts ever last year, over a year ago, um, the person who interviewed me was sharing that she had to bribe other parents for the kids to play with each other, right? Like, kids don't play anymore together on their own. They don't have the space. They don't have the.
Yeah.
I think in your book you also mentioned that the average inmate spend more time outside than kids, right? So where are they going to meet? Online, not on in the street, not creating those communities, not having those block parties. I was in a block party in Toronto. That was fun. But there's less and less. There's less picnics. I think
Mhm.
that there is 60% less picnic than 10 years ago.
Mhm.
So we're losing those activities that are quite fun.
Yeah, I know it's hard. And I think as a parent, you might have to help sort of artificially seed your child's social life in that respect, talking to other parents and getting them to agree to send their kids over. I also limit phone access when kids come over, and I'll say to parents in advance, my kids are phone free. Do you mind if your kid doesn't bring their phone, or at least, leaves it in a common area of the home so that they can go off and play? And what I find is that other parents are delighted at the prospect of someone else policing their own kids' phone use. They're so relieved not to be the bad guy. And I also find that the kids themselves are quite willing to do that too, because they're relieved that someone else is setting that ground rule and giving them the opportunity to play freely, free from the devices, the way that they kind of want to play, but they just feel like they have to be on their phones because everyone else is on their phones. So yes, we can set that up. We can talk to the parents of our kids' friends. We can talk to our kids' teachers. We can talk to the coaches of our children's sports teams. I've heard of some coaches that are now collecting kids' phones in baskets at team dinners so that kids aren't on their phones. If you drive for a carpool, let's say, I talked to a parent who made a rule that the kids could check their phones for 1 minute when they got in the car, text their parents, say, I'm on my way back, whatever it may be. And then all the phones have to go away so that the kids actually talk and, discuss the
Really?
game or the practice that they just had. And they end up, singing and listening to music and making jokes and observing the world around them as they're driving. And she said it's completely changed the experience because before everyone just sat in silence. So I think that they might not even realize it, but they're crying out for adults to, you know, insist on creating a new norm, establishing these new habits surrounding phone use in their lives. And we are the ones who have to do it as the adults. The kids are not going to do it for themselves. They can't. They just don't have the capability. They don't have the knowledge. They don't have the wisdom. They don't have the benefit of retrospection that we have, knowing what it was like to live in a time before everyone was looking at their phone all the time. So yeah, we do owe it to the kids, and it's not easy, but it's a necessity. And I do think ultimately it's well worth the effort.
Thank you for all the knowledge, the story, the hard work that you're doing to collect those stories, to talk, to have those difficult discussions, not only in your family, but with parents, with schools. I hope the discussion with me wasn't too difficult. I quite enjoyed it. And a good way to end with, children's laughter in a car or outdoor. Don't we miss that? The silence of kids just watching their
Mhm.
phone. Children's laughter, guys. That's as easy as that, and we should bring it back. And thanks for all the work. Looking forward to your book. Looking forward to stay in touch and help continue to help those parents, those communities, and build them. So thank you so much for accepting to be our guest today, Katherine. Any parting words?
Oh, well, thank you so much, Christian. It was a pleasure to be on your podcast. I just think that the fact that we are having this conversation is a sign of optimism and of success, that this message is landing with people. When I started writing my book, it came out 3 years ago. So I started writing it, over 4 years ago now. It was a very niche topic. People would sometimes laugh a bit when I said what it was about, and they'd say, oh, that's unusual. Who does that? Who limits their kids' screen time? But the fact that it's just blown up in the mainstream and is such a hot topic, I think, is cause for celebration. And it doesn't mean that we've, won the fight by any means, or that it's not going to be, a challenge. But I think that the fact that we're having this conversation certainly indicates that the cultural tone is shifting and in a direction that really looks like it's going to be benefiting our kids. So thank you for being part of making that happen and amplifying it.
You too. We were perhaps precursor, but there's still a lot of awareness to be had, and more tools and solutions to have those, not only cheat, but concepts of, hey, unsupervised play is okay. Yes, your kid is going to be fine. And actually, in that time, you can also relax and be less anxious.
Mhm.
And then that kind of creates kind of those better balances of giving more freedom, of also putting down the gauntlet when it's time to, and saying, I'm not doing this because other parents or kids or school are doing this, and creating stronger, more confident and competent kids. So thanks again for that. Where can people reach you if they want to reach you or find your books?
Yeah, well, my books are available anywhere books are sold, online. Obviously, Childhood Unplugged is out, and Hold the Phone is already available for pre-order. It will be published in November. My Substack newsletter is probably one of the best places to go because I publish articles. I try to do it once a week, depending on how busy my speaking schedule is. That's called The Analog Family, and the URL is my name, katherinemartinko.substack.com, and my website, katherinemartinko.ca. So that's where you would find me. I do a lot of public speaking. So I speak to parent groups at schools. I speak to students as well. I do professional development workshops for teachers across the continent. Lots of different options there if you're looking for a real in-person experience. I do virtual ones as well, though. But yeah, that's where I spend most of my time these days, is speaking to audiences.
Well, we will definitely invite you some other time in the podcast. And, if Leonard or other of your colleagues want to say hi, we'll be happy to have discussion with the whole work that everyone is doing. It is amazing. As you mentioned, more and more of us are doing it. And again, if you're in Montreal or anywhere else, or to meet live, we said it, is always the best. So I hope that we can laugh together and have our children laugh together as well. So
that would be lovely. Thank you, Christian.
Have a good one. Thanks again.
You too.
Thanks
Bye.
to the listeners.
Thank you.